Out past the last dusty buildings of a town no one talks about, there's a stretch of land so dry it forgot what rain feels like. No green, no shade. Just heat that starts early and settles into your skin like something permanent. The kind of place where the wind doesn't whistle, it scrapes. And in that wasteland, barely clinging to the edge of what might still be called a town, there's a torn-up canvas tent, half sagging, one corner flapping uselessly in the breeze. That's where Miriam Dane lay, still, quiet, alone. She hadn't moved in hours, maybe longer. Her legs, those never worked, not since she was born. Her body, too thin, too dry, crumpled against a splintered crate like an afterthought someone left behind. She'd had some oats once, a water jug now spilled in the dirt. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, and no one, not a neighbor, not a stranger, had stopped to ask why. Her family? They'd packed up 2 mornings before. No goodbye, no drama, just the sound of cartwheels and the lie they told themselves that this was best for everyone. She heard it all from her place on the ground. Didn't beg, didn't scream. She just knew. They were leaving, and they weren't coming back. Have you ever been in a place so still, so empty, it felt like the world had folded in on itself? Like you were stuck between being alive and not being missed? I think about that a lot, about how we're taught to keep moving, to only see what we're told is worth saving. But Miriam, she wasn't loud, she wasn't useful, at least not in the way that world understood. She was just there, and somehow that made her invisible. A man walked by once, a mule cart. He muttered to his animal and didn't stop. Later, another figure on horseback, maybe a soldier, maybe not. He paused. She felt his stare through the light, but then he turned, left dust in his wake. No one helps people like Miriam, not out here, not in places where need looks too much like work. She lay there, jaw clenched, fingers twitching with what little energy she had left. Her skin was sunburnt. Her hair stuck to her face in patches of sweat and grit. Her arms trembled just from holding herself upright. And still she fought sleep, because she knew if she closed her eyes too long, she might not open them again. What surprises me, what breaks me a little, is that she didn't want to die. She thought she might have once, but not like this. Not with her face in the dirt and the world pretending she was never there. And maybe, just maybe, you know what that feels like too. To be forgotten in plain sight. To wonder if anyone sees you when you're not standing tall. But here's the thing, even in the dust, even in that silence, Miriam held on. And someone, eventually, did stop. But that's not this part of the story. This part right here is about the moment just before hope. When everything is still broken, when the wind still hurts, and when the only thing left between you and the end is the decision not to give up. And somehow that decision, that quiet, stubborn, almost invisible kind of strength, that's what kept her breathing. That's where we begin. Miriam Dane was born with legs that never worked. Not broken, just absent. From the very start, her body made her a problem that people didn't know what to do with. And like a lot of families in places where survival gets confused with silence, hers never spoke of it. They didn't name her difference. They just made her carry it quietly. She learned early on how to crawl without making noise, how to stay out of the way, how to read a room faster than most adults. Because she had to. Her existence was always conditional, tolerated, maybe even loved in some soft, complicated way, but never fully accepted, not in the open, not in the daylight. And then, one spring morning, they ran out of excuses. Her father had died years before. Her mother and brothers, the only people she'd ever lived with, packed the cart at dawn. They left her with a sack of oats, tied tight with twine her fingers were too weak to loosen, and a half-full water jug that tipped over before noon. They didn't shout or cry. They just told her it was best for everyone, and left. What do you do when the people who raised you decide you're no longer worth the effort? There's this thing I've noticed. When you're not useful in the way the world expects, folks start to act like you're invisible, like your needs are unreasonable, like just existing is some kind of debt they're tired of paying. I don't know if you've ever felt that, but it stays with you. It reshapes you. For Miriam, that reshaping looked like lying alone in the dust, lips cracked, stomach hollow, body shaking from the effort of just sitting upright. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. She was too weak to even cry. The pain in her muscles was no longer sharp. It had faded into something dull, deep, and terrifyingly quiet. But what's worse than hunger is being left behind on purpose. She tried to stay awake, not because sleep was a luxury, but because she was scared she wouldn't wake up. And that surprised her, this stubborn instinct to live, not thrive, not hope, just live. Because even in the dust, even with nothing left, she still wasn't ready to die with her face in the dirt. There's something hauntingly human about that. I think of Miriam in that moment, sunburnt and barely breathing, her arms trembling just from holding herself up. I think about how many people passed her that day and did nothing. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they just didn't want to be inconvenienced. But she didn't scream. She couldn't. And even if she had, would they have heard her? That's the thing, isn't it? Sometimes the most devastating kind of loneliness isn't when you're truly alone. It's when you're surrounded by people who see you, but choose not to care. And Miriam, she was still there, still breathing, still waiting, not for a miracle, just for something or someone to remind her she still mattered. You'd think, when someone's lying helpless in the dirt, that at least one person would stop. But they didn't. Not for Miriam. The first man passed by on foot, guiding a mule cart. She opened her mouth, tried to call out, but her throat was too dry. Nothing came. He kept moving, muttering to the animal like the world was still ordinary. Later, someone on horseback. A uniform, maybe? The sun was in her eyes, so she couldn't see his face, but she felt it. His gaze, stopping for a moment, like he was trying to decide whether she was real or not. And then he turned the horse around and rode off. And just like that, she was alone again. I wonder about that. How many times do we see someone hurting and decide it's not our business? Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's the belief that someone else will step in. Or maybe it's something simpler, something colder, that helping is inconvenient, that suffering in silence is easier to ignore. Miriam wasn't screaming. She couldn't. But she was visible. She was right there, just beyond the edge of town, where the land turned to dust and the sky forgot its color. Her body lay still under the crooked shadow of a broken canvas tent. Her hands trembled when she tried to hold herself up. Sweat clung to her skin, but the sun just kept burning. And time moved like it had forgotten her too. She stopped hoping after that, not out of bitterness, but because it hurt less than waiting. Still, she fought sleep. That's something I can't forget. The way she held on, not to life as something noble or poetic, but because she wasn't ready to die like that. Face pressed into dry ground, body abandoned, forgotten by everyone who once called her family. She'd known hunger before, she'd known pain, but this
This was different. This was erasure. I think about moments like that sometimes. When you're too exhausted to cry, too hurt to speak, when even breathing feels like defiance. And yet, you don't stop. Not because you believe someone will come, but because there's still something inside you that refuses to give in. Maybe you've been there in your own way. Maybe not on a dusty stretch of nowhere, but in a job where you felt invisible. In a family where you were tolerated but never really seen. In a relationship where silence replaced kindness. And still, you stayed awake. You endured. That's what Miriam did. She didn't yell, she didn't beg. She just kept her eyes open hour after hour, forcing her mind to stay tethered to the body that was failing her. Because deep down, there was still one truth flickering in the heat. She didn't want to disappear. And sometimes that quiet choice to hold on, against all odds, against all logic, that's the bravest thing a person can do.
He didn't come looking for anyone. Jed Hartley was just walking home after 3 days up in the hills, his pack loaded with scrap iron and oak planks, smelling like sun and leather. He wasn't the kind of man people waited for. He lived quiet, worked alone, fixed what needed fixing. Not the kind of carpenter who built homes, he built yokes, coffins, wagon wheels, things nobody noticed unless they broke. Most folks in town called him strange, but useful. The kind of man who nodded instead of waving, who never set foot in church, who sanded wood like it was a kind of prayer. That day, as the sun was starting its slow fall behind the dry ridge lines, Jed saw the tent first, torn, sagging in the wind, like it had given up a long time ago. Then he saw her, a shape in the dirt, still, too still. His boots slowed. He didn't rush toward her, didn't gasp, just looked, quietly, steadily. You get the sense he was the kind of man who'd been around broken things long enough to recognize what could be saved. Miriam blinked when his shadow fell across her face. She didn't know what he was, who he was, or if she could trust him. But something about the way he knelt, slow, not careful in the way people are around something fragile, but in the way someone is when they've done hard work their whole life, made her eyes stay open. He didn't ask what happened, didn't press, just studied her for a second, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small jar of beans, opened the lid, set it beside her. Then he disappeared behind the tent. I think that might have been the scariest part. Not the heat, not the hunger, not even being left behind, but that moment when she thought he might be like the rest, that he'd see her then vanish. But Jed came back, holding 2 old fence rails and a handful of straps, and without a word, he started building her a stretcher. You know, we talk so much these days about grand gestures, about rescues that come with music and speeches. But most real kindness doesn't look like that. It looks like a man using old wood and calloused hands to carry a woman who can't stand. He lifted her gently, with a strength that didn't shake. She cried out once, just a small sharp sound, but he didn't flinch. He laid her down on the makeshift stretcher, patted the cloth beneath her head, adjusted the straps, and then, without asking for anything in return, he tied the stretcher to his horse and took her home. He didn't say he'd save her. He didn't ask what she could offer back. He just saw someone who needed help and chose not to walk away. And maybe that's where it all began. Not with a promise, not with love, just with the quiet decision to stop for once and stay.
Jed didn't ask questions. Not that first night, not the morning after, not even when Miriam could barely lift her arms to feed herself. He didn't press, didn't prod, didn't fill the silence with his own story to make hers feel smaller. He simply made space for her and for whatever she needed to carry quietly. And I think there's something deeply rare about that. He gave her water first, not just handed it to her, placed the tin cup within reach, close enough that she didn't have to ask. Then came food, just enough to wake her body up again. A jar of cold beans, a spoon. No ceremony, no you should eat, just quiet offering. He laid her gently on a cot near the back wall of his shop, where the light was softer and the air still held the scent of cedar and worn leather. The room was small, but it felt lived in. Tools lined the shelves, scraps of wood leaned against the corners. A stove sat cold but ready. You could tell it wasn't built for guests, and yet she was there, and nothing about her presence felt like an intrusion. That's what struck me most when I first heard this part of their story, how Jed never made her feel like she owed him an explanation for her pain. He didn't pity her, didn't treat her like she was broken glass. He just paid attention. When her hands couldn't reach the plate, he helped. When she flinched in her sleep, he adjusted the blanket. When her cup tipped, he picked it up, wiped the floor, and set it back. All of it, silent, steady, matter of fact. There's a kind of healing that begins long before the body catches up. Sometimes it starts with being in a space where you're not asked to perform your story, where you don't have to justify your presence, where your existence isn't met with questions, but with care. I don't know if you've ever had that. A room where you didn't have to explain yourself. A person who didn't try to fix you, but simply stayed close while you found your own way back. That's what Jed offered Miriam. Not rescue, not salvation. Just a chair beside the fire. A spoon. A quiet room that didn't echo with judgment. And that first night, as he laid a second blanket over her legs, without a word, without asking if she needed it, something shifted in her. She didn't feel safe yet, not fully, but she didn't feel afraid either. And sometimes that's the first kind of safety we get, the one that says, you don't have to tell me everything. You don't have to be anything but here, breathing, healing, at your own pace. So she lay there, the weight of that warmth across her knees, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself rest. Not because she gave up, but because for once, someone else had chosen not to walk away.
Healing doesn't usually happen in big, cinematic moments. Most of the time, it's slow, it's quiet. You don't even realize it's happening until one day, something that used to feel impossible doesn't. For Miriam, it started with a bar of soap. Jed had left it beside the wash basin, along with a clean cloth and a small tin of water from the well. He didn't say much, just placed it within reach and sat back down at his workbench, back turned, not because he didn't care, but because he did. Because he knew sometimes dignity comes from being given space. So she reached for the basin, slowly, carefully. Her arms were stiff, her fingers clumsy after days of lying still, but she managed. Face first, then her neck, her hands. Just that simple act, washing her own skin, was a kind of return, a way of saying, I'm still here. And Jed? He never hovered. He didn't offer help unless she asked. He didn't fill the air with instructions. He just made sure what she needed was close enough to try. I think about that a lot. How rare it is to be supported without being controlled, to be helped in a way that doesn't make you feel helpless. Little by little, Miriam began to re-enter her body. She fed herself, even if it was just a few bites at first. Her voice, when it came, was soft and cracked, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. But it was hers. She used it sparingly, never more than a few words, but Jed always listened when she did. He never rushed her, never made her prove anything. And when she asked to help with the leatherwork, threading small grips for a tool handle, he nodded once and handed her the materials without question. No big speech, just trust. There's something deeply human about being given a role again, about contributing even in the smallest ways. It reminds you that you're not just being kept alive, you're being allowed to live. I remember someone once telling me, dignity isn't about standing tall. It's about being seen as whole, even when you're not standing at all. That stayed with me. And watching Miriam sit at the edge of that cot, stitching slowly with trembling fingers, I think she understood that too. She wasn't getting better in the way most people measure. She still couldn't walk, still needed help with the heavier things, but her eyes were clearer, her hands steadier. Her silence no longer felt like retreat, it felt like rebuilding. Jed never treated her like a burden. Not once. And that, maybe more than anything else, is what brought her back. Not medicine, not miracles, just patience, respect, time. So no, Miriam wasn't someone rescued. She was someone returned to herself, to purpose, to a place where she was no longer just being cared for, but quietly, steadily becoming part of the care.
At some point, without saying it out loud, they started working together. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a moment where Jed stood in front of her and said, "You're ready." It was quieter than that, more natural, like breath coming back after you'd been holding it too long. One afternoon, he set a scrap of leather and a curved needle on her lap. Didn't explain, didn't instruct, just looked at her and asked, "You sew?" She hesitated. Her fingers traced the edge of the leather, unsure but curious. "Used to," she said softly. "Then let's see if they remember," he replied, and returned to his bench without another word. That's how it began. He'd give her small pieces, straps, bindings, sometimes raw hide still stiff from the sun. She'd sit on her cot or near the crate by the window, slowly threading the needle, testing tension, letting her hands learn their way back into the rhythm. When she grew tired, he didn't comment. When she made mistakes, he didn't correct her with that sigh people use when they think they're being helpful but are really just impatient. He just let her try again. There's something sacred in being asked to contribute, not out of pity, not to keep someone busy, but because your effort matters, because someone believes you still have something to give. Jed never made her feel like she was helping for show. He didn't praise her with the careful tone people use around the fragile. When she finished stitching a grip, he examined it, gave a short nod, and handed her another, like she was part of the work, not just passing time in it. I think that's what changed her the most. She wasn't just healing, she was building. Side by side with a man who didn't see her as a patient or a project, but as a partner. Not equal in strength, maybe, or speed, but in purpose. Have you ever had that? Someone who looked at you, not at your limits, but at what you could do with what you had left. It's rare, and it's powerful. One morning, he brought her a small block of wood and a strip of sandpaper. "Try this," he said. She blinked, unsure. "You want me to shape it?" "Just smooth it, no rush." So she did. Slow, careful strokes. Her arms ached, her palms stung, but she did it. And when she lined up two pieces on the crate and Jed passed by and murmured, "Good work," she didn't smile outwardly, but inside, something opened. They didn't talk much while they worked, just the sound of scraping, stitching, the occasional clink of metal on wood. But in that silence, something solid formed. A rhythm. A kind of trust that doesn't need words. She was no longer someone being cared for. She was someone whose hands, though slow, made real things. And that made all the difference.
It didn't happen in a flash of light or a dramatic moment. That kind of thing only happens in books or movies made for people who've never really known what it's like to come back from nothing. For Miriam, the change came in pieces, quiet, almost invisible to anyone looking from the outside. But to her, It felt like being brought back to life. There's something sacred about being needed, not in a loud, desperate way, but in the soft, steady rhythm of small contributions, stitching a leather strap, sanding a block of wood, lining up 2 joints just right. Every task she completed was like a whisper from her old self saying, "You're still in here." I think most of us underestimate what it means to feel useful. Not for applause, not for show, just to know that what you do matters to someone else, that your hands, even if they shake, still create something someone will use. And Jed, without ever saying so, made sure she knew. When he passed by and gave a quiet, "Good work," he didn't say it like a teacher grading homework. He said it like someone acknowledging a partner. That little nod, it hit deeper than he probably realized, because it wasn't just approval, it was proof that she wasn't being kept out of pity, that her presence in that space meant something. Have you ever had that moment where someone genuinely sees what you're capable of, not what you've lost? It changes you. I remember once, years ago, I was in a place where everything felt stuck. I couldn't see a way forward, and worse, I felt like I wasn't contributing to anything or anyone. Then, someone handed me a job. Small, boring even, but they trusted me with it. And in doing it, just doing it well, I felt the fog start to clear. That memory came back to me while hearing Miriam's story, because her confidence didn't return all at once. It came with every time Jed asked her to try something and didn't hover, every time she reached for the work on her own, every time he asked, "You think this fits?" Like her opinion wasn't just welcome, it mattered. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was participating. And that's the difference. She could feel it in the way her body began to respond again, not just with pain, but with purpose. The soreness in her arms after a full afternoon of stitching felt earned. The dust on her dress, the calluses forming on her palms, they weren't signs of weakness. They were reminders that she was coming back into the world, not as someone being carried, but as someone choosing to stand, however she could, with her own kind of strength. And that, I think, is what real resurrection looks like. Quiet, steady, built one task at a time until, slowly, you recognize yourself again. And this time, you belong.
Jed didn't tell her he was building it. He didn't measure her quietly at night or ask offhand about her height. He didn't talk about plans or blueprints or what he thought she needed. He just watched how her arms trembled each time she shifted in bed, watched how she reached for the work near her cot, how her fingers gripped the rim of the wash basin a little tighter each morning, watched how she was trying not to be saved, but to move. And one afternoon, without ceremony, he placed a wooden box by her side. Inside were wheels, old cart rims sanded and oiled, a seat frame wide and low, leather straps still coiled, a pair of half-shaved armrests. She looked up at him, stunned. He didn't smile, didn't soften his voice, just said, "It's not charity. You belong here, if you want." And I swear something shifted in the air right then, because it wasn't just a gift, it was permission. It was him saying, "You don't have to crawl anymore. You don't have to wait until someone carries you. You deserve your own way forward." That chair, scrap-built and handmade, was more than wood in wheels. It was a key. It was freedom wrapped in bolts and leather. Not perfect, not polished, but real. And hers. Have you ever had someone offer you something like that? Not because they pitied you, but because they believed in the life you could have, if you just had the right tools. I think most of us don't realize how rare that is, to be seen not as a burden, but as capable, if given the space to try. Miriam didn't speak right away. Her hand rested on the rim of the unfinished seat, her eyes scanning each piece, like they might disappear if she blinked.
And Jed, steady as always, crouched beside her and said, "We'll finish it together." It took a few more days. The wheels rattled a bit. The seat creaked when she first sat down. But when he finally lifted her from the cot and helped ease her into it, she didn't cry, she didn't flinch, she just held her breath and then exhaled, slow and steady, as if she'd been underwater for too long and didn't realize it. Jed stepped back, arms crossed, and nodded. "Try it." She placed her hands on the wheels, pushed forward. The chair moved. Not far, not fast, but it moved because she moved it. And that's what mattered. No longer dragged, no longer waiting. She wasn't being moved, she was moving. I don't think we talk enough about what that kind of independence feels like, how power can return in quiet ways, a wheel turning, a hand steadying, a man saying, "You're not here out of pity, you're here because you matter." And for Miriam, that moment, on that uneven patch of dry earth behind the shop, wasn't about escape, it was arrival. It was hers. All of it. Finally.
The first time Miriam moved the chair on her own, the world felt different. It was late morning. The sun had just started rising past the edge of the shed out back, throwing long light across the dry yard. Dust floated in slow motion. The wind was soft, not sharp like before. Jed stood a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes steady. He didn't hover, didn't coach, just nodded once and said, "Go on." Her hands, still raw in places, trembled as they found the rims of the wheels. She'd watched him build this thing for days, piece by piece, without ever asking for anything in return. And now, it was real. Under her, holding her weight. She pushed once, tentative, unsure. The chair rolled a few inches, uneven, wobbly, but it moved. That moment, it split something wide open inside her. Not because she went far, not because it was easy, but because for the first time in her life, her body answered to her. She wasn't being dragged, she wasn't waiting for permission. She was moving, by choice, by strength. She pushed again, a little harder. The chair tilted slightly on the packed dirt, but didn't tip. Her breath caught. She steadied, then tried turning. One hand slow, one hand strong. It didn't turn clean, but it turned. And that's when she laughed, out loud, a quick, startled sound, like it had surprised her as much as him. She looked over at Jed, her chest rising fast, her eyes shining in a way that wasn't just sunlight. "It works," she whispered. He nodded again. "It does." I think about that a lot, what it means to take back even the smallest bit of control, especially after the world spent years reminding you what you can't do. Have you ever felt that shift? That moment when you realize you don't have to wait for someone else to decide if you're ready? That you can, in your own time, your own way, step back into your life, whatever that looks like now? Miriam didn't glide across the yard that day. She bumped over roots, got stuck on stones. She had to pause and catch her breath more times than she'd admit. But she kept going, not because she had something to prove, but because, for the first time, she could. And Jed, quiet as ever, stayed just a few paces behind, watching, clearing rocks when she needed it. Not leading, not pushing, just being there. By the time they came back inside, her arms were shaking with effort. Her dress was dust-streaked, her palms red. But her eyes? Her eyes were calm, like someone who'd touched freedom with their own hands. And maybe that's what made the difference, because the chair wasn't just a thing built to carry her, it was a doorway, and she had walked through it.
It didn't happen overnight. There wasn't a single moment where they sat across from each other and said, "This is what we are now." Love, or whatever you want to call it, doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it shows up like a hand resting near yours on a table, a long pause between sentences, a silence that feels safe. Jed talked first. It was late and the stove had burned low. They were both tired, the kind of tired that goes deeper than the body. And out of nowhere, in that hush, he said, "I used to have a brother." He didn't say it like a confession, more like a memory that had been waiting quietly in the corner of the room. His name was Caleb, he said, older than me by 2 years, always running toward trouble, always dragging me with him. He chuckled, then looked down. He didn't make it out. The fire took the barn, the tools, him. There was no drama in his voice, just a steady weight of something lived with for too long. After that, he added, I stopped going into town, stopped talking much. Miriam didn't speak right away. She just watched him, eyes soft, like she was seeing a part of the man behind the calluses and the quiet. And then she nodded. I know what that feels like. Not fire, but being left. Her voice was quiet but clear. My family? They said I was a burden. Said I'd slow them down. So they left me with a sack of oats and a jug of water. Said they'd be back. Jed didn't interrupt. Didn't flinch. Just let her speak. They never came back, she said. And for a long time, I believed it was my fault. That I deserved it. There's something powerful about telling the truth in a room where no one tries to fix it, where no one tries to wrap your pain in platitudes, just two people, scarred in different ways, laying their histories out like weathered maps on the same table. And maybe that's where the real shift happened. Not in grand gestures, not in promises, but in the simple act of choosing to be known. I've always believed love doesn't start with rescue. It starts with recognition, with looking at someone else and seeing not what's broken, but what's been carried, and choosing not to turn away. Jed didn't reach for her hand. Miriam didn't lean her head on his shoulder. But something passed between them in that quiet. Something steady, unspoken, true. Two people, long considered lost causes by the world outside, deciding, day by day, gesture by gesture, that maybe they weren't broken beyond repair. Not because they saved each other, but because, finally, someone had stayed and kept listening.
It's strange how closeness sometimes grows in the quiet. Not in the noise of declarations or grand moments, but in the rhythm of two people sharing a space, eating, working, breathing, without needing to fill the air with anything more. That's how it was for Jed and Miriam. They'd sit across from each other at the end of the day, bowls of stew balanced in their hands, the same table, the same silence. But it was never cold. It was the kind of silence that holds you gently, the kind where nothing needs explaining, because the presence alone says, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. There was comfort in the ordinary, in passing tools without asking, in knowing the way she liked her tea, strong with a bit of honey when they had it, in watching how he oiled the hinges on the front door every other Sunday without fail. They didn't talk about what they were building, not the furniture, not the routine, not even the life that was slowly taking shape between them, but it was happening anyway. One afternoon, the sky hung low with rain. Miriam sat near the window, her chair turned just slightly, working thread through a thick strap of leather. Jed was across the room, carving something she couldn't quite see. She looked up and said, almost absent-mindedly, I didn't think men like you existed. Jed paused, didn't look at her right away, just let the words settle between them like dust in the quiet. Then, with a small smile, he replied, I figured the same about you. That was it. No big moment. No shift in music, no swelling of emotion, just two people acknowledging what had been growing all along. And sometimes that's enough. I think a lot of us are taught that connection has to be loud to be real,
that love is only valid if it comes with fireworks or long speeches or letters you fold into drawers. But what if it's more like this? Two people, left behind in different ways, quietly choosing each other every day, not out of need, but out of respect, not to fill a hole, but to share a piece of ground. Have you ever had that? A relationship that doesn't demand anything of you but your presence, where you're not expected to perform or pretend, but just be. That's what they had, and maybe that's why it lasted. Because when words did come, rare and quiet as they were, they meant something. Not because they were poetic, but because they were true. It happened on a Thursday, just after sundown. The air still held a trace of heat from the day, but the wind had started to shift. You could smell the dry grass, the wood smoke from the stove, the faint sweetness of something baking in the oven. Bread, probably. Miriam was in the doorway, wiping her hands on a cloth, the chair creaking slightly beneath her as she turned to look out across the yard. Jed stood by the fence, tightening a crooked hinge with a rusted screwdriver. Nothing urgent, just one of those little things he always noticed. There was no crowd, no ceremony, not even a bouquet, just the sound of the gate swinging once and then stillness. He walked back toward her slowly, not nervous exactly, just careful, like the moment deserved to be handled with both hands. He stopped in front of her, scratched the back of his neck the way he always did when words were hard to say. Then he looked her in the eye. "I don't have a ring. Never had much for jewelry." She didn't blink, didn't move, just waited. "I don't have a fortune tucked away either," he went on, "but I have this place and these hands and the promise that I'll never leave you behind." Then he added, quieter now, "If that's enough, I'd be proud if you would stay." That was it. No kneeling, no rehearsed speech, just a man saying in the simplest way he knew how, "I choose you. Not because I have everything to offer, but because I want to offer what I have." And Miriam, she smiled. Not the kind of smile people wear when they're being watched, but something deeper, like something inside her had been held in place for years, and now, finally, it could let go. She reached out, took his hand. "She didn't come here looking for a ring," she said. "I came looking for somewhere I wouldn't be left again." Then she nodded once, firm as her voice. "So yes, I'll stay." You know, I think there's something beautiful in that kind of simplicity. We're taught to expect proposals with glitter and grand gestures, but maybe the truest kind, the kind that lasts, comes down to something quieter, something built from everyday acts, from trust earned slowly over time. Have you ever been offered something like that? Not perfection, not a fantasy, just someone saying, "This is me, and this is where I'll be every morning if you want to wake up beside me." That night they ate dinner as usual, bread, beans, a few slices of dried apple, nothing fancy, no toast, no music, but they sat a little closer. And in the quiet between bites, something had shifted, something small but steady, like the first nail set in a frame that one day might be called home. The word married was never said out loud. There were no witnesses, no white dress, no paper with signatures, no vows recited before a crowd. But if you stepped into the small house tucked behind the old cottonwoods, you'd know. You'd feel it. Jed worked the wood. Early mornings, late afternoons, sawdust clung to his sleeves like snow. He'd whistle sometimes, low, tuneless, and Miriam would pause whatever she was doing just to listen. Not because the tune mattered, but because the sound meant he was near, still there. She swept the floors. Not every day, just when the sun angled right and the dust showed up like a soft warning. She'd hum while she folded cloth or sorted bolts and scraps. her hands stronger now, more sure. Sometimes she'd patch canvas. Other times, she'd rearrange the workshop shelves. Jed never asked her to, but he never complained either. He'd just raise an eyebrow, then nod like it somehow made more sense that way. They worked side by side, not in big gestures, but in quiet cooperation. There was no scorecard, no need to prove who did more. It was understood. This was theirs. The work, the home, the rhythm. And in town, when someone asked, Jed would say, "My wife likes the curtains drawn in the morning," or "My wife stitched that bag." Just casual, matter of fact, like it had always been true. Miriam never corrected him. Didn't need to. Because what do words matter when the life is already being lived? I think about that sometimes. How many people spend so much energy trying to name a love, trying to post it, define it, wrap it in declarations so loud they can barely hear each other. But some loves don't need naming. Some loves are just a pair of worn boots at the door beside a single cane, a bowl passed without asking, a moment where you look up and know, this person knows me, and they stayed. Have you ever seen that kind of love? The kind that doesn't flash, but holds? I remember once watching an old couple on a train. They didn't speak for the whole ride, but every few minutes, he'd tap her arm gently when the announcements came on, and she'd nod, just barely. And that told me more than any poem ever could. That's what Jed and Miriam had. They never made it official by law, but everything about their days said otherwise. From the way he leaned the broom against her chair after sweeping, to the way she laid his tools in just the right order on the bench. It wasn't perfect. There were bad days, of course there were. But they never talked about burdens, never used words like "oh" or "help," because no one was being rescued. No one was being carried. They were building. And sometimes that's what love really is, not being someone's answer, but becoming part of the same question.
In the early days, Jed would glance toward her every few minutes, half checking, half marveling. But over time, the glances grew fewer. Not because he stopped caring, but because he no longer needed to worry. Miriam was fine, more than fine. She moved through the house with a quiet steadiness, her wheelchair rolling smooth over the worn wooden floorboards. She'd figured out every corner of that little home like it was a map she had redrawn herself. Reaching, turning, balancing, none of it rushed, none of it proud, just sure. I remember her once reaching the top shelf in the pantry with a wooden grabber she carved herself from scrap oak. Jed came in, saw her hanging a bundle of dried sage, and simply nodded. No praise, no comment, just a look that said, "You got it." And she did. The laundry, the spice jars, the leather repairs, small things maybe, but it wasn't about what they were. It was about the way she did them, with intent, with ownership, as someone who wasn't being looked after anymore, but looking out, just as much as he was. There's something powerful in that kind of shift. When a person who was once seen as fragile becomes essential. When hands that were once held begin to hold back. Have you ever witnessed that in someone? It's not always loud. Sometimes it's just the creak of a wheel turning before dawn, the scrape of kindling arranged carefully at the hearth, the sound of hammering outside followed by the smell of stew warming indoors. And Jed stopped calling what she did help. He stopped asking if she was up for it. He started handing her the better blade, started asking her opinion before sealing a deal in town. He didn't speak of her like a miracle. He spoke of her like a partner. "My wife says we should move the workbench nearer the light," he once told a neighbor. And she's right. She usually is. There was no hierarchy between them, no quiet sympathy, no unspoken pity, just two people running a home, running a life. And maybe that's what Miriam had needed all along. Not rescue, not sympathy, but a place where her choices mattered, where her muscles were trusted, where she was asked instead of told. I think about that a lot. How many people carry invisible weight simply because no one ever handed them the reins? How much of our potential gets buried under assumptions? But not here. Here, Miriam rolled through the narrow garden paths she had helped plant, hung herbs to dry with fingers that used to tremble, and at night, when Jed sat on the step oiling his tools, she'd sit beside him, not because she had to, but because she belonged there. And in that quiet, there was no question who she was. Not a burden, not a guest, but a woman who had come back to life, and then, without anyone asking, started building.
It was late afternoon when the knock came. Jed was out back mending a fence, and the wind had started to carry the smell of pine smoke. Miriam was alone in the house, sorting dried beans into jars, her hands steady, her focus clear. The kind of quiet work that gives you space to think, but not to worry. The knock wasn't hesitant. It was hard, sharp, like someone wanted the door to feel it. She wheeled herself to the front slowly, not with fear, but with something else, something firmer. She opened the door, and there he was, a man she recognized though she hadn't seen him in years, the way you remember a winter that nearly broke you. He didn't greet her, didn't even look her in the eye, just said, "They want you back. You don't belong here." There was no kindness in it, no apology, just the cold assumption that she was still where they'd left her, weak, dependent, theirs to claim or discard. I wonder if you've ever had someone try to drag you back into a version of yourself you've outgrown. Someone who doesn't see who you are now, only who you were when you were under their roof or under their thumb. Miriam didn't flinch. She didn't ask Jed to step in, didn't call for help. She sat there in her chair, legs quiet, back tall, and said, calm and low, "I'm not going anywhere, and you don't get to decide where I belong." The man scoffed, muttered something about what a shame, turned to go, but before he reached the gate, she added, "Tell them next time, don't send a threat, send an apology, or nothing at all." And that was it. He left. No fight, no shouting, just the sound of boots on gravel and a door that clicked shut behind her. Jed came in a little later and asked who it was. She told him simply, "No one important." But I think that moment, those 3 minutes on the porch, might have been one of the most important in her life. Because it wasn't just about standing up to a man, it was about standing in herself, owning who she'd become, not needing to be rescued, not even by someone she loved, not needing validation, just clear, quiet strength. I think we all hope for that moment at some point, that moment where we realize we're no longer who they left behind, where we stop explaining ourselves and simply exist, solid, steady, unshaken. And for Miriam, that porch became a kind of line, before and after, power taken and power reclaimed. Not with fists, not with shouting, just with the simple, undeniable truth, I am not yours to control, not anymore. She went back to her jars after that, poured the beans into rows, lid after lid clicking shut, and outside the wind shifted again, warmer this time, like even the air knew it had nothing left to take from her.
There's a kind of love that doesn't need music swelling in the background. It happens quietly, in small, irreversible choices. Jed didn't tell her he sold the rifle. She only noticed it was gone when she reached to dust the shelf by the door. The rifle had always been there, propped neatly beside the coat hooks, oiled and ready, like most men kept them in that part of the world. Not for show, for survival. But now, in its place, sat a folded wool blanket and a new tin of salve. Stronger wheels leaned against the far wall. A wooden tray that fit perfectly across her chair's arms. All hand-built, all thoughtful, all bought or made in trade for what that rifle once meant. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. Jed came in from the yard, wiping his hands on a cloth. She looked at him steady, then simply said, "You sold it for me." He shrugged. Didn't need it anymore. There was a time, months ago, when that gesture would have made her flinch. When being the reason someone gave something up would have felt like a debt she couldn't repay. But not anymore, because this wasn't charity, and it wasn't sacrifice either. It was trust, and that changed everything. She rolled a little closer, rested her hand on the arm of his chair. Her voice was low, quiet but firm. "If it ever came to it, I'd protect you too." He didn't laugh, didn't joke, just nodded once, like he believed her. And he did. Because by then, Miriam wasn't the same woman who'd been left in the dust on the edge of town. She wasn't someone to be carried or kept safe like a fragile thing. She was his partner, and more than that, his equal. It made me think, how often do we measure love by what we give up instead of what we build together? How often do we assume one person has to be the strong one, the savior, the shield, when real love is standing shoulder to shoulder, each ready to take the next hit for the other if it came to that? And maybe it never would. Maybe the danger was past, the hard times behind them. But that didn't make her words any less true. Because protection isn't always about guns or guards. Sometimes it's just knowing someone would stay up late if you were sick, that they'd walk into town for thread because you mentioned you were running low, that they'd notice you hadn't spoken in a while and sit with you anyway, without needing to fix it. It's in those things, the rifle gone, the blanket folded, the unspoken promise, I'll take care of you, you'll take care of me. And when Jed smiled that day, it wasn't soft or sentimental, it was sure. He had given something up, but what he got in return wasn't just care. It was someone who stood next to him not because she had to, but because she chose to, and would again, every time. That kind of bond doesn't break. And once it's forged, you stop fearing what might leave, because you've already built what will stay. It happened on an evening so quiet you could hear the moths tapping the window pane. Summer was folding into fall. The light was soft, low, golden, the kind that makes everything look like it's been dusted with memory. Jed wasn't a man of speeches, never had been, and Miriam had come to love that about him, the way he moved through the world without needing to announce himself, the way he showed up over and over again with his hands, his time, his stillness. But that night he sat beside her, knees touching. He cleared his throat once, then reached into his shirt pocket and took out something small, wrapped in a bit of old cloth. Nothing fancy. Inside was a silver ring. Simple. No stone, no engraving, the kind of thing you might miss if you weren't looking for it. But it had a weight that went beyond its size. He said, "It's not much, but it's yours." She didn't cry. Miriam had learned, through years of silence and dust, and being told she was a burden, how to hold things in. But in that moment, she felt something shift, not like an explosion, more like a slow door creaking open. Because it wasn't just a ring, it was what came next. He told her, quietly, like he was sharing a blueprint still being sketched in his mind, that he wanted to build on a new room, just a small one, off the east wall, where the morning sun would reach first. A room with low shelves and clean space. A room for a crib. And he said it like it was possible, like it wasn't strange that a man with calloused hands and a woman in a handmade wheelchair could speak of raising a child together, not out of fear or obligation, but out of the strange, brave thing they had made between them. Love not as a rescue, but as a foundation. I remember sitting with this part of their story for a long time, just letting it settle. Because isn't that what we all hope for?
Not the grand gestures or public declarations, but the quiet promises, the ones whispered into soft light, the ones built with hands and wood and intention. How many of us grew up thinking love was about being chosen? And how powerful is it to instead choose, to build, to stay, to plan not just for each other but for someone not yet here? Jed didn't need a ring to make a vow, but he brought one anyway, just as he brought his tools, his patience, and his belief that a future with her wasn't something to be pitied, it was something to be proud of. And Miriam, in the way she curled her fingers around the ring, in the way she looked at him, not surprised but steady, said everything back without a single word. They were already a family. This was just the next room they'd build. Together.
There's something different in the way Miriam speaks now. Not louder, not bolder, just quieter in a way that makes you listen, like each word has passed through fire and come out forged, heavier than before. One evening, she sat beside Jed on the front step, her wheelchair parked just a little to the left where the sun hit the edge of the porch. The woods were quiet, just birdsong and the creak of the trees in wind. And she said it. Not dramatically, not to prove anything, just like a fact she finally accepted. You didn't save me, Jed. I stayed because I chose to. You didn't rescue me. You gave me a place where I could remember I was allowed to exist. There was a long silence after that. Not uncomfortable, just full. I think moments like that don't happen all at once. They're built over time, through every simple meal shared, every small task handed over with trust, every glance that said, "I see you," without needing to say anything at all. For a long time, Miriam believed she ended here, that after being cast aside, forgotten, labeled a burden, this cabin in the woods was where the world had left her to fade quietly. But something shifted. And it wasn't because someone came in to save the day like in a storybook. It was because someone stayed, listened, let her rebuild herself. You ever feel like that? Like maybe what's happened to you has already written the ending? That your story's been boxed in by what others decided for you? It's easy to believe that when the world keeps reminding you of your limits. Harder to believe you still get to write the next chapter. But Miriam did. Not out of hope exactly, but out of defiance. Later that same evening, she looked at the home they'd built together. Pieces of wood shaped by Jed's hands, spaces she helped organize, small details that bore her touch, and she said softly, "I didn't just end up here. I earned this, every piece of it. I deserve it." That kind of belief, it doesn't come from compliments or encouragement. It comes from surviving long enough to know you're more than what was done to you. From building a life one slow, quiet decision at a time. Jed didn't argue. He just nodded. Because he knew she was right. And maybe because a part of him needed to hear it too. This isn't the part of the story where everything becomes perfect. But it is where you see what true healing looks like. Not flashy, not loud. Just a woman claiming her space, her voice, and her worth. Not because someone gave it to her, but because she finally saw it in herself. And that, maybe that's the bravest thing of all.
Of all the ways a story can end, maybe the quiet ones are the most powerful. No music swells, no crowds applaud. Just two people sitting by a window as the sun slants in through the wood frame panes, dust catching the light like tiny stars. The scent of pine shavings, warm bread, worn leather. The rhythm of their days, now so familiar, it feels like breath. Jed and Miriam. Two people who were once, by all appearances, forgotten. Not in the dramatic way of novels, but in the slow erosion life sometimes deals. A brother lost to fire, a body left in the dust of a world too busy to stop. They were not broken in ways you could always see, but they had been left behind. That much was true. And yet, that's not how the story ends. Because they didn't stay broken, and they didn't wait around to be saved. They chose something else, something harder, something quieter. They chose to build. It started with small things: water in a tin cup, shared silence, work done side by side without commentary. And over time, what they built wasn't just a home or a routine, it was dignity. It was trust. It was the slow stitching of wounds that didn't need to be explained, only acknowledged. I think a lot about the difference between rescuing someone and showing up for them. One is loud. One is often uninvited. One can feel like power. The other, showing up, staying, building, is humble. And it asks you to let go of control, to simply be present without needing to fix, without needing to be the hero. That's what Jed and Miriam gave each other. They didn't complete each other. They weren't halves seeking a whole. They were full, separate people, scarred, but alive, who decided again and again to stay, to listen, to keep showing up. And there's something deeply human about that choice. Because maybe that's all any of us really want, not to be rescued, but to be seen, to be valued, not for what we were or what we lost, but for who we're becoming. To be loved not in spite of our pain, but with it. By the end, no one was calling Miriam a burden. She was moving through the house on her own wheels, sorting supplies, giving advice, cracking dry jokes when Jed misplaced his tools. And Jed wasn't hiding from the world anymore. He was carving a cradle. They weren't victims. They weren't saviors. They were partners, in the truest sense of the word. And I think that's the quiet triumph of this story. Not that they found each other, but that they chose each other. Not just once, but every day. No one needed saving anymore. Because together, they'd already built something stronger than rescue. They'd built a life.
There's a moment, quiet, almost too quiet to notice, when a life that once felt impossible begins to feel real. And not in a loud, triumphant way, but in the stillness of a Tuesday morning, sunlight coming in through the small kitchen window, a wheel turning gently across a wooden floor, the scent of coffee and cut pine in the air. For Miriam, that moment came slowly, not all at once, not with fireworks, but in layers. First, the wheelchair Jed built. His hands, his time, his care, all poured into something just for her. Not as a favor, not as pity, but as recognition. A gesture that said, "You belong here. Move how you need. This world adjusts to you, not the other way around." Then the home. Not just walls and a roof, but the space between two people that grows when trust is watered daily. The quiet comfort of shared chores, the clinking of tools, the ease of a glance that says more than words ever could. Jed never said, "You're safe," but everything about the way he carved her name into the chair rail of their front porch said it for him. And now there's the child. A new room being built out back, the frame rising slowly each day. She watches Jed measure and cut and lift with care, while her hands rest over the curve of her belly, still not showing much, but already full of meaning. And maybe fear, too, but not the same kind as before. Because here's the thing. There was a time Miriam didn't believe she'd survive, let alone thrive, let alone become someone who could raise another life. She had lived too long being treated like weight, like something to carry or leave behind. And that kind of belief, once planted deep, takes everything to undo. But this small house, this stubborn man, this unexpected future, they did something remarkable. They didn't fix her. They reminded her she had never been broken in the first place. And that's the quiet power of real belonging. When the world no longer sees you as someone to rescue, but someone to build with. When you're no longer afraid of being left behind, because the place you found, this person, this home, this life, it's not moving on without you. It's waiting with you, growing with you. I think about that sometimes, about how we all carry a list in our heads of things we've convinced ourselves we'll never have,
a partner, a home, a family, a sense of peace in our own skin. But what if that list isn't permanent? What if it just needs to be rewritten, one moment at a time? For Miriam, the proof is all around her now. A chair she rolls herself, a bed that creaks beside another body at night, a child not yet born, already loved. She doesn't wonder if she belongs anymore. She knows. She doesn't fear being left because she's already been chosen. And this time, not for saving, but for staying.
In a town where people were known more for what they left behind than what they stayed to build, something different took root. It didn't begin with fireworks, no big declarations, no miracles, just two people, each with their own quiet history of being left, who looked at one another and said, "I'm still here." That kind of choice isn't loud. It doesn't ask for applause. It shows up in early mornings and shared meals, in the sound of a broom on a porch, in a hand resting gently on another's back as they pass in a narrow hallway. You don't always notice it growing, but one day you wake up and it's everywhere. Maybe you've lived in a place like that town, a place where goodbyes come easy, where people move on, move away, move faster. Maybe you've even been the one walking out the door, thinking it was the only option. But this story, it reminds me that there's a different kind of strength, the kind that stays. Jed and Miriam didn't stay because they had to. They weren't trapped or settling or hiding from the world. They stayed because they chose each other, not once, but again and again, in small ways that added up to something whole. And it wasn't perfect. Life never is. There were rough edges and days that ached. There were memories too heavy to shake loose. But they didn't let those things define the rest of their story. They built something that could hold both the sorrow and the hope, something quiet, steady, and real. I think that's what makes it powerful. Because in a world that moves so fast, where even love starts to feel disposable, choosing to stay, choosing to hold on, to show up, to build slowly and without spectacle, that's an act of courage. That's the kind of love I believe in. And that's how it ends, not with a rescue, not with a transformation, but with a choice, one that echoes softly through the days and years that follow. In a town where people used to walk away, Jed and Miriam stayed. Slowly, quietly, imperfectly, but firmly.